16 years ago, a young mother in Fort Worth lost everything in a single night. Her husband vanished on a quiet family trip, and her 8-year-old daughter, Lucia, disappeared without a trace. Police searched for months, but with no bodies, no leads, and no motive. Her family's story faded into silence. Yet Margaret Halbrook never gave up. She searched every junkyard, every record, every whisper of hope. Until one day, a blue handbag appeared, one detail that everyone else had overlooked. What she found next would uncover a nightmare hidden for over a decade and lead to one of the most chilling rescues in small-town Texas history. In the summer of 1984, a young father and his 8-year-old daughter vanished during what was supposed to be a simple weekend road trip out of Austin, Texas. They left behind a wife and mother who would spend the next 16 years trapped between grief and hope, clinging to the impossible idea that one day she might find out what happened. But on an otherwise ordinary afternoon, fate would deliver a discovery that shattered the silence of the past and reopened a mystery long thought buried. The golden autumn light spilled through the windows of Margaret Halbrook's modest living room, casting narrow ribbons of sunlight across the oak floor. She sat quietly on a faded floral couch, the television remote clenched tight in her hand, a small, nervous ritual that had become her yearly tradition. Beside her sat her mother, Doris Barrett, her posture rigid, her eyes heavy with the kind of pain that time never truly heals. "It's almost time," Margaret murmured, her voice barely more than a whisper. She turned up the volume just as the local news broadcast began. For 16 long years, on this exact date, Margaret had paid local stations to run a missing persons alert, a desperate reminder to the public of the family she'd lost. The commercial faded, and there they were again, the same familiar images that haunted her dreams. A smiling man with warm brown eyes and a thick mustache, standing beside a bright-eyed little girl. Next to them gleamed a red 1979 Cadillac DeVille. The announcer's voice filled the room, solemn and practiced. 16 years ago today, Jim Halbrook and his 8-year-old daughter Lucia vanished during a weekend drive. They were last seen traveling in a red Cadillac DeVille, license plate THB 143. If you have any information, please contact the Austin Police Department. Margaret's thumb trembled as she clicked off the TV. The sudden silence in the room felt unbearable. "I'll go freshen up," Doris said softly, squeezing her daughter's hand before slowly making her way upstairs. Margaret nodded absently, her eyes drifting toward the bookshelf on the far wall. She stood, walked over, and pulled down a worn leather-bound photo album, a relic she had both cherished and feared to open. The pages smelled faintly of dust and old paper. She turned them gently, one by one. Jim beaming beside the Cadillac he'd worked so hard to buy. Lucia grinning on her first day of school, her tiny backpack nearly swallowing her. The three of them laughing together at Barton Springs, sunlight sparkling off the water behind them. Margaret traced her finger along her daughter's face. "Where are you?" she whispered, her voice cracking. The sudden ring of the phone sliced through the quiet. Margaret startled, setting the album aside before hurrying into the kitchen. "Hello?" she said, breathless. "Mrs. Halbrook, this is Officer Daniels with the Austin Police Department." The man's tone was measured, professional, but there was something beneath it. "We've received a report about potential evidence discovered at a junkyard in San Marcos. It may be connected to your husband and daughter's case." Margaret gripped the counter. "What kind of evidence?" "I'm afraid I can't discuss the details over the phone, ma'am. We'd like you to come identify what was found. We can have a patrol car at your residence in about 10 minutes. "Yes," she said quickly. "Yes, I'll be ready." Hanging up, Margaret rushed to the bottom of the stairs. "Mom," she called. "The police found something at a junkyard in San Marcos. They think it might be about Jim and Lucia." Doris appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale. "What did they find?" "They wouldn't say, but they're sending a car to take us there." "I'm coming with you," Doris said firmly, already descending. They waited in heavy silence until the rumble of a patrol car echoed down the street. The officer who stepped out introduced himself as Officer Martinez, a kind face, though he offered little conversation as they drove south along the highway. Through the window, the Texas countryside blurred by in muted shades of gold and brown. Margaret's hands twisted nervously in her lap, while beside her, Doris clutched her purse so tightly that her knuckles turned white. An hour later, the car turned into Harrow's Auto Salvage on the outskirts of San Marcos. Police vehicles were scattered among the rows of rusted metal, their lights casting cold flashes across the sea of junked cars. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the wind. Margaret's stomach churned. Officer Martinez guided them through the maze of twisted steel and broken glass toward a small crowd gathered at the far end of the yard. "Detective Reyes," he called out. "Mrs. Holbrook and her mother are here." A tall man in plain clothes turned to greet them. His expression was calm but guarded, the kind of face that had learned to balance empathy with duty. "Mrs. Holbrook, Mrs. Barrett," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Detective Samuel Reyes. Thank you for coming so quickly." Margaret's voice was quiet, almost trembling. "Please, Detective, what did you find?" And as he stepped aside, her world began to shift, slowly, silently, toward a truth she had both longed for and feared to face. ChatGPT said, "What did you find?" Margaret asked, her voice calm, but her hand trembling at her sides. Detective Reyes stepped quietly out of the way, revealing what the officers had been gathered around. For a moment, Margaret's world seemed to tilt. There, half buried beneath years of rust and ruin, was the skeletal shell of a car she knew as well as her own heartbeat. A red Cadillac DeVille. Its once radiant paint had dulled to a tired maroon, flecked with patches of corrosion, the chrome edges eaten away by time. Yet despite the decay, Margaret knew instantly. This was Jim's car, the one he had worked overtime for years to afford, the one he polished every Sunday morning, the one he and Lucia had driven away in that final weekend 16 years ago, and never returned. "Oh my God," Doris whispered, her voice breaking as she reached for her daughter's arm. Margaret stepped closer in slow, unsteady movements, her breath quickening. The car had been crushed in places, twisted by the weight of the nearby excavator parked beside it. Police officers moved around methodically, snapping photos and jotting notes, the sharp click of their cameras cutting through the heavy stillness of the junkyard. "We can't examine the interior yet due to its condition," Detective Reyes said softly. "But we need your confirmation. Is this your husband's car, Mrs. Holbrook?" Margaret circled the vehicle as though walking through a nightmare she'd been trying to wake from for 16 years. Her eyes scanned every inch until they landed on a small dent in the chrome hubcap of the right rear wheel, a tiny imperfection that meant everything. "Jim hit a curb the week before they disappeared," she murmured, her voice far away. "We were supposed to get it fixed that weekend." Her words faded into the air as she looked up at the detective, tears gathering but refusing to fall. "Yes," she whispered. "This is his car." Detective Reyes nodded solemnly and gestured toward a man standing awkwardly a few yards away, nervously wringing a rag in his grease-stained hands. "This is Dean Lamb, the owner of the junkyard. He's the one who contacted us." Dean stepped forward, his expression filled with regret. "Mrs. Holbrook, I'm so sorry. I didn't know the history of this car. It was supposed to be crushed this morning. But after I went back to my office and saw your family's photo on the local news alert, I recognized it immediately. I called the police right away." Margaret's grief sharpened into suspicion. "How did it get here, Mr. Lamb? Who brought it in?" Dean shifted uneasily. "That's the strange part, ma'am. I don't have any record of it. No paperwork, no drop-off logs, nothing. It's not in our system at all." "That sounds suspicious," Doris cut in sharply, her tone edged with distrust. Detective Reyes raised a calming hand. "Mrs. Barrett, I understand your concern, but Mr. Lamb did the right thing by reporting the vehicle. Right now, we have no reason to believe he's involved." Dean nodded quickly. We follow strict procedures here. Identification, signed release forms, the works. I can't explain how this car ended up on my property. Before anyone could reply, a woman in oil-stained overalls approached cautiously, wiping her hands on a rag. "I saw Reed bring it in," she said suddenly. All eyes turned toward her. "Reed?" Detective Reyes repeated. Dean exhaled. "Reed Carraway, my partner. He runs the technical side of the business. Head mechanic here." Reyes immediately pulled out his phone. "We need to talk to him. Can you reach him?" Dean nodded, dialing quickly, but after several moments, his face darkened. "No answer." "Then I'll need his address," the detective said firmly. Dean retrieved a small, oil-smudged notebook from his pocket and scribbled down an address. "He lives in South Austin," he said, handing over the slip of paper. Reyes passed it to one of his officers. "Send a unit to that address right now. Bring Mr. Carraway in for questioning." Turning back to Dean, he asked, "Does Reed have an office here?" "He does," Dean replied, "but it's locked. Only he has the key." "We'll need a warrant," Reyes said to another officer. "Get it started." Margaret stood motionless, her gaze fixed on the crushed Cadillac. 16 years of sleepless nights, unanswered prayers, and fading hope, all condensed into this single, unbearable moment. The car that had carried her husband and daughter away was finally found, but there was still no sign of them. Detective Reyes's voice broke through her thoughts. "We'll need to search the area," he instructed his team. Then, turning to Margaret and Doris, his tone softened. "If you feel able, Mrs. Holbrook, Mrs. Barrett, your help in identifying any personal items could be invaluable." Margaret nodded faintly, her voice a whisper, "Whatever it takes." And as the officers fanned out across the junkyard, the low hum of their radios faded into the dry Texas wind, a sound that felt like the ghost of 16 years whispering through twisted metal and broken dreams. Margaret and Doris followed the officers as they methodically combed the junkyard, each rusted heap and discarded fender a small, cruel reminder of the years they'd spent searching for answers. Hours bled into an aching, silent stretch where nothing of Jim or Lucia surfaced, leaving Margaret to lean against a cinder-block wall with exhaustion carved into every line of her face, while Doris draped an arm around her shoulders and watched the sun climb higher, until at last 2 cruisers rolled in and a dark blue pickup pulled up behind them. And a clean-cut man in his mid-20s climbed out, wearing work pants and a shirt stamped with the yard's logo. Reed Carraway, the head technician. Detective Reyes moved toward him immediately, introducing himself and then bluntly asking how a red Cadillac connected to a 16-year-old missing persons case came to be in their lot. And Reed, visibly startled, admitted the car had been brought in about a week earlier by an older man who paid cash, abandoned the keys, and vanished before Reed could get a name. His description of a thin, quiet man with a thick mustache, glasses, khaki pants, and a weathered face made Margaret's breath catch because it fit details she'd carried for years about Jim, though the idea of Jim abandoning the Cadillac he adored felt impossible. And when Detective Reyes asked Reed whether the stranger had left any paperwork, Reed shook his head and said there was none, only the keys. So Reyes asked for Reed's cooperation, requested his address, and pulled officers to dispatch a unit while arranging to get a warrant to search Reed's locked office on site. Dean Lum, the yard owner, explained the car wasn't logged in, and that Reed's co-worker had actually seen Reed bring it in, which only deepened the mystery. Why would a man who loved that car surrender it? And why would someone who looked like Jim be the one to drop it off? And though Doris's suspicion flared and Margaret's hope lurched between belief and disbelief, Detective Reyes kept them calm and pragmatic, telling them their identification of anything personal in the yard could be crucial and that they would press on until every corner, office, and file had been examined. "We'd like to search your office, Mr. Carraway," Detective Reyes said evenly. "One of your co-workers mentioned you keep it locked." Reed nodded without hesitation. "Yeah, of course. Nothing to hide, just some expensive tools and old parts catalogs. Follow me." The group made their way across the gravel lot toward the small building that housed the junkyard offices. Margaret and Doris trailed behind, their steps slow and heavy. "Do you really think it could have been Jim?" Doris whispered. Margaret shook her head, her brow furrowed. "I don't know. The description fits, but none of it makes sense. Why would Jim abandon the car after all these years? And where's Lucia? Maybe whoever brought the car in wants to throw us off," Doris murmured. At the end of a narrow hallway, Reed stopped before a plain metal door and fished a ring of keys from his pocket. He unlocked it and stepped back, letting Detective Reyes and 2 uniformed officers go in first. "Please wait out here," the detective told Margaret and Doris. "We'll let you know if we find anything." As the women sat on a nearby bench, Doris suddenly pressed a hand to her chest, gasping. "Mom," Margaret said, startled. "What's wrong?" "My asthma," Doris wheezed, fumbling through her purse. "The stress. My inhaler." Margaret quickly retrieved the inhaler and helped her mother use it. After a few tense moments, Doris's breathing slowed. "I'm fine now," she insisted, still pale. "Just need to catch my breath." Detective Reyes appeared at once, concern etched across his face. "Do you need an ambulance, ma'am?" "No," Doris said firmly. "Please, don't make a fuss. I'm okay." Inside, the officers continued their search. Occasionally, one emerged holding a small object, a watch, a photo, a piece of jewelry. But each time, Margaret could only shake her head. None of it belonged to Jim or Lucia. After nearly an hour, Reyes reappeared, removing his gloves with a sigh. "We've completed our search," he said gently. "Unfortunately, there's nothing here that directly connects to your husband or daughter." Margaret's shoulders slumped. "So we're no closer to understanding what happened." "We've made progress," Reyes replied, his tone steady. "Finding the Cadillac was a major step. Now we need to determine who brought it here and why." He turned to Reed. "Mr. Carraway, we'll need you to come down to the station to give a formal statement." "Of course," Reed said quickly. "Whatever you need." "Mrs. Holbrook, Mrs. Barrett," Reyes continued. "We'd appreciate it if you joined us too. We'll go over the case in light of this new evidence." Margaret nodded. "We'll come." "I'll drive myself," Reed offered. "I'm heading back toward Austin anyway." Reyes studied him for a moment, then agreed. "All right, we'll expect you there within the hour." Margaret helped her mother to her feet as they walked toward the patrol car. "Are you sure you're up for this?" she asked softly. Doris squeezed her daughter's arm. "I wouldn't miss it. If there's even a chance we'll learn what happened to Jim and Lucia, I need to be there." They climbed into the cruiser just as Reed started his blue pickup, the small convoy pulling away from the junkyard beneath the relentless Texas sun. The crushed red Cadillac glinted in the rearview mirror, a silent relic of everything they'd lost. At the Austin Police Department, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting stark shadows across the faces gathered in a narrow conference room. Margaret and Doris sat on one side of the table, opposite Detective Reyes and another officer. Reed gave his statement in a separate room. "Let's go through the timeline again," Reyes said, flipping open a thick case file. "Fresh eyes can sometimes reveal what familiarity hides." Margaret nodded, folding her hands tightly. Jim and Lucia left on a Saturday morning, October 12, 1984. Jim had built his dental practice here in Austin from the ground up. He was well respected, the kind of man everyone trusted. He had this signature style, colorful ties, that big mustache. His patients adored him. "And Lucia?" Reyes prompted gently. A small, wistful smile softened Margaret's face. "She was 8, bright, curious, full of energy. She loved her father. They were inseparable when she wasn't in school." "You didn't go with them?" the second officer asked, jotting notes. "No," Margaret said quietly. "Mom needed help that weekend. She was rearranging her house after Dad passed. It was supposed to be just one night. Jim planned to drive Lucia out to Llano, show her the fall colors in the hill country, maybe stop by Enchanted Rock. They were supposed to be home by Sunday evening." Her voice caught slightly on the last words. because for 16 years, that Sunday evening had never come. "And when did you first realize something was wrong?" Detective Reyes asked quietly, though the answer was already written in the thick file before him. "Sunday night," Margaret replied, her gaze distant. "Jim promised to call when they left Yano. When I hadn't heard from him by dinner, I tried the motel. They said they'd checked out that morning. I called friends, relatives. No one had seen or heard from them. By Monday morning, I went to the police." Doris reached across the table and clasped her daughter's hand. "We've been looking ever since," she said softly. Reyes nodded, his voice steady. The investigation at the time was thorough. Officers checked every gas station and diner along their route. They interviewed the motel staff. Surveillance was limited back then, but we did what we could. Jim's bank accounts and credit cards were never used again. His dental practice stayed untouched. The second officer added, "Technology in 1984 wasn't what it is now. No cell phone records, limited cameras. We were working with very little." Margaret's voice trembled, though her words carried the sharp edge of frustration. "And now, 16 years later, his car suddenly turns up in a junkyard, brought in by a man who looks just like him." The room fell into a tense, heavy silence. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the space. Finally, Detective Reyes closed the file folder and leaned forward, his eyes serious. "Mrs. Holbrook, I need to ask, is there any chance your husband left voluntarily?" Margaret froze. "Absolutely not," she said, her tone firm, almost defiant. "We had a good marriage. He adored Lucia. His practice was thriving. There was no reason for him to leave us." "Sometimes people carry secrets," Reyes said gently. "Parts of their lives they hide, even from those closest to them." Margaret shook her head. "Not Jim. And even if that were true, he would never have taken Lucia. Never." At that moment, the door opened, and a female officer stepped inside. "Detective, Mr. Carraway's statement is complete. He's waiting in the lobby." "Thank you," Reyes said, rising. He turned back to Margaret and Doris. "We'll continue investigating. The car will be processed thoroughly. We'll trace its movements, examine what we can recover. For now, I suggest you both get some rest. It's been a long day." Margaret glanced at her watch. It was already past 2. "Yes, we should," she murmured. "We can have an officer drive you home," Reyes offered. They made their way toward the lobby, where Reed sat hunched in a plastic chair, scrolling absently through his phone. He stood when they approached. "All done?" he asked. "Yes," Margaret said. "Thank you for your help." "For today," Reyes added, extending a polite nod. "We'll be in touch if we need anything else, Mr. Carraway." Reed looked between the women, his tone casual. "I can give you a lift. I live up in Hyde Park." Reyes frowned slightly. "That's not necessary, Mr. Carraway. We can—" Before he could finish, a uniformed officer approached, whispering something urgent in Reyes's ear that drew him away from the group. Margaret hesitated, glancing at her mother. Doris looked pale and tired. The wait for a police escort or a taxi could take hours. Against the quiet thrum of unease in her stomach, Margaret made a decision. "We'd appreciate the ride," she told Reed softly. "You've already been cooperative, and the police know where you work." When Reyes returned, Margaret quickly explained. He looked reluctant, but nodded. "All right. I have his plate and contact info on file," he said firmly. "Call me immediately if there's any problem." Outside, Reed's dark blue pickup waited by the curb. He opened the passenger door for Doris, helping her in, then stepped aside as Margaret climbed into the middle seat beside her. "Where in Hyde Park are you headed?" he asked, starting the engine. "Speedway near 45th, Margaret replied, keeping her voice neutral. Reed nodded and merged into the steady stream of traffic leaving downtown Austin. The afternoon light shimmered off the windshield as they drove north, 3 strangers connected by a mystery that had refused to die. Reed gave a small shrug, smiling as he steered the truck smoothly through the late afternoon Austin traffic. "I'm on Avenue H, not far from there at all. Funny we've never crossed paths before," he said lightly. Margaret returned a polite smile. Austin's big enough to hide in plain sight, she replied, glancing at the quiet streets as they headed north. The drive was calm at first, Reed chatting easily about neighborhood changes, how the city felt different now, more crowded, less personal. Margaret listened, half present, her thoughts drifting to the crushed Cadillac and the ghost of Jim's voice that still haunted her memory. Then, suddenly, Doris gasped and began patting at her purse and coat pockets. "What's wrong, Mom?" Margaret asked, alarmed. "My inhaler," Doris said, her tone sharp with worry. "I think I left it back at the Goudon junkyard office when I had that attack earlier." "Are you feeling all right?" Margaret pressed. "I'm fine now," Doris assured her quickly. "But I need that inhaler. It's my prescription one. I just got it last week. It was expensive." Reed glanced over. "I've got asthma too," he said. "I keep a spare inhaler at home if you need one. We can swing by my place real quick." "That's kind of you," Margaret said. "But maybe we can stop at a pharmacy instead." "It's prescribed," Doris insisted. "I don't want to waste money on another when mine's probably sitting on that desk at the junkyard." Margaret frowned. "Now? That's almost an hour away." Reed waved a hand. "I don't mind driving. Really, it's no trouble." "You've already done enough," Margaret protested. "We can call a taxi later." Doris shook her head firmly. "That would cost a fortune, Margaret. Mr. Carraway's offering to help." "Please, call me Reed," he said with an easy smile. "And seriously, it's fine. That place is like my second home anyway. We'll be there and back before dinner." Margaret glanced at her mother's determined face and sighed. "If you're sure, Mom?" "I'm sure," Doris said. "I don't want to waste a perfectly good inhaler." "It's settled then," Reed said, signaling a U-turn. "Back to San Marcos we go." The dashboard clock read 3:05 as they pulled once more into Harrow's Auto Salvage. The police had cleared the scene hours earlier, though yellow tape still circled the crushed Cadillac like a silent warning. Only a few workers remained, moving scrap metal under the sharp metallic clang of tools. Dean Lame looked up from behind the counter, eyebrows lifting. "Reed, Mrs. Holbrook, I thought y'all left with the police." "We did," Reed said easily. "But Mrs. Barrett thinks she left her inhaler here after her asthma attack." Dean's expression softened. "Ah, yes. I actually found it after everyone left. I put it in your office for safekeeping, figuring you'd make sure it got back to her." "How thoughtful," Doris said gratefully. "Would you mind if I grab it now? It's my prescription one." "Of course," Dean said. "Reed's got the key." Reed nodded, fishing his keyring from his pocket as Margaret and Doris followed him down the dim hallway. He unlocked his office door and stepped inside. "I'll just grab it real quick," he said, disappearing into the room. Margaret sank into one of the plastic chairs by the wall, her shoulders slumped from exhaustion. Doris stood just outside the doorway, pacing restlessly. The junkyard was quiet now, save for the distant whine of machinery. Minutes passed. Margaret frowned. "What's taking him so long? It's just an inhaler." Doris stopped mid-stride, her expression shifting. Her eyes narrowed toward the office. "Margaret," she whispered urgently, leaning close. "When he opens the door, look at the top shelf of the glass cabinet across from it." "What? Why?" Margaret asked, startled. I caught a glimpse when he went in," Doris said quickly. "I think I saw a blue handbag sitting up there between some books." Her voice trembled. "It looks like Lucia's." Margaret's pulse spiked, her breath catching in her throat. "That's impossible, Mom," she whispered. "Lucia's bag was with her when she disappeared." But as she turned her eyes toward the dark doorway of Reed Carraway's office, a chill crept down her spine, because some part of her, deep and unspoken, already feared that her mother might be right. "Just look," Doris urged, her voice tight. "It's the same shade of blue, Margaret. I'm sure of it." Before Margaret could respond, the creak of the door broke the tension. Reed stepped out of his office, holding Doris's inhaler. "Found it on my desk," he said casually, handing it over. But Margaret's gaze stayed fixed on the small gap in the doorway, where the glint of a blue handbag sat perched on the top shelf of a glass cabinet. "Reed?" she said, her tone steady but sharp. "That blue bag in your office. What is it?" He turned, following her gaze, and for the briefest moment, his shoulders stiffened. "Oh, that? Just an old bag of my daughter's," he said lightly. "It looks exactly like my daughter's," Margaret said quietly. "The one she had when she disappeared." Reed paused. "Really? That's quite a coincidence. Would you mind if I take a closer look?" she asked, already rising from her chair. Reed hesitated, then shrugged. "Sure, I guess. It's nothing special." Dean looked up from behind the counter. "Didn't know you had a daughter, Reed." Reed's jaw tightened. "She's not with me anymore," he said quickly. "Lives with her mother in Houston." Margaret and Doris followed him back to his office. Reed unlocked the door again and reached up to the top shelf, retrieving the bag. "Here it is," he said, handing it to Margaret. "My daughter got it for her birthday one year, never really used it." Margaret's hands trembled as she took it. The handbag was identical, a small rectangular shape with white trim and a clasp that clicked softly when opened. "Lucia saved her allowance to buy one just like this," she murmured, "in 1984. "This looks vintage," Margaret added, carefully turning it over. "What year did your daughter get it?" Reed shifted uneasily. "Oh, I don't remember. Maybe a few years back." Doris's voice cut through the air. "It's identical to a style from the early 80s. I'm surprised they still make them." Reed gave a forced laugh. "You know how trends recycle. Vintage is back in." Margaret unlatched the clasp. The inside was clean, too clean. She ran her fingers along the lining, her fingertips brushing something smooth and faintly familiar. "It's in remarkably good shape," she said softly. "Like I said, she barely used it," Reed replied, his voice quick. "You can keep it if you want. I've just had it collecting dust here." Margaret's head snapped up. "You'd give away your daughter's birthday present?" Reed shrugged again. "She's not missing it. If it gives you some peace, why not?" "That's very generous," Margaret said slowly. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely." His expression was unreadable. "Didn't the police see this when they searched earlier?" Doris asked suddenly. Reed nodded. "They did. I told them it was my daughter's and they moved on." Doris took the bag from Margaret and studied it closely. Inside, near the seam, was a white ribbon tag sewn into the lining. She squinted. "There's no manufacturer name, just a blank tag. It looks like something was printed here once, but it's been erased." Margaret leaned in, her pulse quickening. The faint smudge of faded ink still lingered. "That's odd. What kind of birthday gift comes with the tag removed?" Reed's tone hardened just slightly. "It was a gift from a friend at her school. I wouldn't know." Margaret rubbed the vinyl surface again. The texture, the stitching, the weight of it. It all matched the memory of Lucia's bag. "We'll keep it," Doris said suddenly, clutching it to her chest. "If you don't mind." "Go ahead," Reed said. "It's yours." "Thank you," Margaret murmured, though her unease deepened. As they walked back across the junkyard, the late day's sun cut sharp lines through the dust. Neither woman spoke until Reed stepped away to talk to Dean near the office. "It's Lucia's bag," Doris whispered, her voice trembling. "The tag was tampered with. Someone tried to hide its age." Margaret nodded faintly, her mind spinning. But how would Reed have it? And why would it be in his office? "I don't know," Doris said, her eyes narrowing. "But something isn't right. First Jim's car turns up here and now this." "Let's not jump to conclusions," Margaret whispered, though her own doubts clawed at her chest. "It could still be coincidence." "Do you really believe that?" Doris asked quietly. Before Margaret could answer, Reed returned, his tone cheerful. "All set?" he said, as though nothing had happened. "Yes," Margaret said, forcing a smile. "Thank you again." Reed started the truck, and they pulled away from the junkyard. The highway stretched before them, long and silent. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dashboard as Margaret sat with the blue handbag clutched tightly in her lap. Reed glanced over. Finding that car must have been quite a shock, he said conversationally. 16 years. That's a long time to wonder. It is, Margaret said softly. Tell me about them, Reed said. Your husband and daughter. What were they like? Margaret hesitated, studying his profile. So calm, so unreadable. Still, she spoke, her voice quiet. Jim was a wonderful man. A dentist, loved by everyone. He had this goofy sense of humor, used to wear ties with cartoon teeth on them just to make his patients laugh. Reed smiled faintly. Sounds like a character. He was, she said. And Lucia, she was pure light, smart, curious, full of ideas. She loved fashion, even at 8. She saved her allowance for weeks to buy that blue bag. Margaret brushed her fingers over the vinyl, her throat tightening. It was from the Barbie collection, a limited edition. She carried it everywhere. She reached into her purse and pulled out a worn photograph. Jim, standing beside the red Cadillac, his arm around a smiling Lucia in her bright pink outfit, the same blue handbag gleaming in her hand. Reed glanced over, and for a fleeting instant, something unreadable flickered across his face before he turned back to the road. This is them, Margaret said softly, holding out the photo for Reed to see. It was taken about a month before they disappeared. Reed gave it the quickest glance before turning his eyes back to the road. Nice-looking family, he said, his tone oddly casual. Then he added, almost under his breath, she was missing her 2 upper teeth and that pink rainbow shirt. Margaret froze. Her grip tightened around the photograph. She hadn't mentioned the rainbow on Lucia's shirt, or that it was her top teeth missing. He hadn't looked long enough to notice those details. From the back seat, Doris went completely still. Margaret could feel her mother's stare burning into the back of Reed's head. Yes, Margaret said carefully, sliding the photo back into her purse with trembling hands. That's right. The rest of the drive stretched in uneasy silence. Every few minutes, Margaret caught Reed glancing at her, or perhaps at the blue handbag, in the rear-view mirror. Each time she met his gaze, he looked away, his expression unreadable. The hum of the tires on the highway was the only sound between them until, at last, Reed slowed in front of Margaret's house in North Austin. Here we are, safe and sound, he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Thank you again, Margaret replied, her voice even but tight. My pleasure. Let me know if you ever need anything else. I'm in the book. Reed Caraway. Doris had already stepped out of the back seat, waiting by the curb. Margaret joined her, and together they watched as Reed's truck turned the corner and disappeared from view. Neither spoke until they were inside. Margaret locked the door quickly, sliding the deadbolt into place before pressing her back against it. Did you hear what he said? Doris whispered, her voice shaking. About Lucia's teeth and the rainbow shirt? Margaret nodded slowly, sinking into a chair. He couldn't have seen those details from just glancing at the photo, she said. Margaret, Doris said, leaning forward. Is there any chance he could have known Jim or Lucia, that he's hiding something? Mom, that's a serious accusation, Margaret said, though her tone lacked conviction. Maybe he's just observant. Some people have sharp eyes. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. Margaret looked down at the blue handbag, turning it over in her trembling hands. If this was really Lucia's, she murmured, her name would be inside. I always marked her things so they wouldn't get mixed up. I remember, Doris said softly. She hated when I wanted to write her name on this one, Margaret continued, her eyes unfocused, lost in memory. So I told her we'd put a sticker inside instead. Something cute just for her. She paused, swallowing hard. That bag was from a Mattel limited edition Barbie collection. But there were knockoffs too. Department stores sold similar ones. Doris nodded, but her expression stayed tense. Even so, don't you think that's too many coincidences? Margaret didn't answer. She ran her fingers along the edge of the bag again, feeling the faintly worn vinyl, the same stitching pattern, the blank tag with the erased text. It all felt too familiar. Let's go to an antique shop, Doris said suddenly, a note of resolve in her voice. Someone there will know. If it's really from the 80s, they'll recognize it, and then we can take it to the police. Margaret met her mother's eyes and nodded. You're right. Mr. Keller over on Burnett Road still runs that antique shop. He knows vintage pieces like the back of his hand. She stood, clutching the handbag. If we hurry, we can get there before he closes. Doris rose too, her earlier fatigue replaced by determination. Then let's go. We need to know the truth. Moments later, Margaret's sedan pulled out into the fading amber light of late afternoon. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, the air between them heavy with both hope and dread. Doris sat beside her, holding the blue handbag in her lap as though it were a fragile relic of the past. Burnett Antiques should still be open, Margaret said, glancing at her watch. If anyone can tell us what this bag really is, it's Mr. Keller. They drove in silence, the hum of the engine blending with the low murmur of Austin traffic, neither woman daring to speak the thought pressing at the edge of both their minds. That what they might learn tonight could change everything. The weight of the day's discoveries pressed down on both women as the car hummed softly along Burnett Road. The crushed red Cadillac, the eerie familiarity of the blue handbag, and Reed's strange comments all looping endlessly in Margaret's mind. Do you really think this could be Lucia's bag? Doris asked quietly, running her finger along the white trim. Margaret's hands tightened on the steering wheel. I don't know what to think anymore, Mom. If it really was Lucia's, and Reed lied, why would he keep it for all these years? 20 minutes later, they pulled into the narrow parking lot of Burnett Antiques, a small, time-worn shop squeezed between a bakery and a hardware store. The air outside carried the scent of yeast and machine oil, but as soon as they stepped through the door, the aroma shifted to old books, wood polish, and faint traces of history. A brass bell jingled overhead. Inside, glass display cases gleamed beneath warm lamplight, filled with vintage jewelry, porcelain figurines, and rows of carefully labeled keepsakes. Larger furniture pieces lined the back wall, each bearing handwritten tags in Mr. Keller's neat cursive. The shop owner, a kind-faced man in his 60s, looked up from behind the counter. Mrs. Holbrook, Mrs. Barrett, he greeted warmly. What a pleasant surprise. What brings you in today? Hello, Mr. Keller, Margaret said, offering a tired smile. We were hoping you could tell us something about this handbag. She nodded to Doris, who carefully set the blue bag on the counter. Well now, Mr. Keller said, adjusting his glasses and leaning closer. Interesting piece. Children's accessory. Looks early 1980s to me. He turned it over thoughtfully. But this isn't quite my area. Let me get Robert from the back. He's the real expert on vintage collectibles. He disappeared through a curtained doorway and returned a moment later with a man in his 40s, salt and pepper hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a gentle, analytical expression. Ladies, this is Robert Kay. He's our in-house specialist for toys and collectibles. His wife's a big Barbie collector. If anyone can identify this, it's him. Pleasure to meet you, Robert said, nodding courteously. Let's have a look. He carried the handbag to a well-lit counter and began examining it with careful precision, checking the vinyl grain, the stitching, the clasp hardware. He opened it and ran his fingers along the seams, his motions methodical, practiced. May I ask what exactly you'd like to know about it? He asked, looking up. We want to confirm if it's an original Mattel product, Margaret said, from their limited Barbie accessory line in the early 80s. And if possible, the exact year. Robert nodded, retrieving a jeweler's loop from his pocket. The stitching quality and material are consistent with Mattel's craftsmanship from that period, he murmured. And this particular blue, if memory serves, was part of their Barbie World collection. He studied the zipper pull under the light. Even this shape, it's the right style for that production run. Then, reaching for his phone, he added, Let me call my wife. She'll know the precise details. While he stepped away to make the call, Margaret and Doris exchanged a glance. He seems to think it's authentic, Doris whispered. her eyes bright with fragile hope. "That still doesn't prove it was Lucia's," Margaret reminded her softly. "Only that it's from the right time." Robert returned a few minutes later, smiling faintly. "My wife confirmed it. This handbag was part of Mattel's limited edition Barbie collection from 1983 to 1984. That particular blue was only manufactured for about 8 months. Doris exhaled slowly, gripping the counter for support. Margaret's stomach knotted. Robert turned the bag in his hands once more, his expression tightening slightly. "But this is interesting," he said, frowning. "The identification tag, it's been tampered with." Margaret leaned in. "Tampered with how?" "See this?" Robert pointed with the tip of a pen to the small white ribbon sewn inside the lining. "The fabric's puckered and there's slight discoloration. Someone deliberately removed the printing, most likely with heat." "Heat?" Doris echoed. He nodded. "Yes, probably a household iron. The ink was melted out. You can still see faint traces of lettering under the light here." He tilted the tag toward them, revealing the ghost of faded print. "The surface has been plasticized, heat-treated just enough to erase what was there. It doesn't smell of burnt polyester anymore, but the distortion is classic heat damage." Margaret stared at the bag, her pulse quickening. "So someone intentionally removed the original marking?" "That's what it looks like," Robert confirmed. "Someone didn't want anyone tracing where or when this was made." Doris and Margaret exchanged a glance, the truth settling in like a cold wind. Whoever had possessed this bag after 1984 had gone to deliberate lengths to hide its identity. ChatGPT said. Robert pointed to the small tag again, his voice calm but precise. "There's also physical wear around the lining. See that faint warping? It's consistent with heat exposure. Someone deliberately tried to remove whatever identifying information was printed here." Margaret's heart began to pound. "Could it have just faded naturally over time?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Robert shook his head. "No. Natural fading would affect the entire tag evenly. This kind of damage is concentrated only where the text was. Someone heated this area intentionally, probably to erase the serial and manufacturer details." He glanced up curiously. "If you don't mind my asking, why is this particular bag so important?" Margaret hesitated, then offered a measured smile. "It just looks exactly like one my daughter used to have. I was curious if it might be the same model." Robert nodded, apparently satisfied. "Well, I can confirm it's authentic. Mattel, early 80s from their limited Barbie accessory line. My wife would love to see it sometime. She's a serious collector." "Thank you," Margaret said softly. "You've been very helpful." "Anytime," Robert said, returning the bag with care. "No charge. Always happy to help identify a vintage piece." They thanked both men and stepped back out into the golden evening light. Once inside the car, Doris turned toward Margaret, her face pale but resolute. "Someone deliberately removed that tag," she said quietly. "This isn't just coincidence, Margaret." Margaret ran her thumb along the warped edge of the fabric. "I know." "We need to tell the police," Doris insisted. "Reed's connection to both Jim's car and this bag, it's too much to ignore." Margaret nodded slowly, her resolve hardening. "You're right. Even if it's not Lucia's, they need to know." She started the car, determination steadying her voice. "Let's go straight to the station. Detective Reyes should still be there." The blue handbag rested between them as they pulled out of the parking lot, the hum of the tires underscored by the weight of their discovery. Margaret's thoughts raced. About Reed, about the erased tag, about how Jim's Cadillac and this handbag had both surfaced under his watch. They'd only driven a few blocks when the dashboard lit up. A red brake warning icon flashed. The steering wheel vibrated faintly beneath her hands. "That's strange," she murmured, pressing the brake. The pedals sank almost to the floor. "What's wrong?" Doris asked, clutching the bag. "I don't know. The brakes feel soft." Margaret pumped the pedal again. Nothing. The car began to lose speed as the engine sputtered. "Something's not right," she said, her voice tightening. She guided the vehicle toward the curb and eased it to a stop just before an intersection, shifting into park as the engine coughed and died. She tried to restart it, but the ignition only clicked uselessly. "This has never happened before," she muttered, stepping out to check under the hood. Doris joined her, peering into the engine bay. No smoke, no leaking fluids, just silence. "Should we call a tow truck?" "I guess we'll have to," Margaret sighed, fishing for her phone. "There goes our trip to the station tonight." But before she could dial, the low rumble of an approaching engine made her look up. A dark pickup slowed beside them and eased to the shoulder. Margaret's stomach dropped. Reed Carraway climbed out from behind the wheel. Another man, a broad-shouldered figure with a weathered face, stepped out from the passenger side. "Margaret, Mrs. Barrett," Reed called, feigning surprise. "Everything all right? I was just passing by and saw you pulled over." Margaret forced a tight smile, her pulse spiking. "What a coincidence," she said evenly. "The car just quit on us. Brake light came on, then it stalled." Reed walked toward the front of the sedan, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Mind if we take a look?" he asked lightly. "This is my buddy Jason," he added, nodding toward the other man. "He's great with cars." Jason gave a polite nod before leaning over the open hood, inspecting the engine. The rhythmic hum of passing traffic filled the air as the two men peered into the car's guts, while Margaret stood frozen beside her mother, unease crawling up her spine like ice. ChatGPT said, "What exactly happened?" Jason asked, leaning over the open hood while Margaret described the sudden brake failure. He probed around for a few minutes before standing upright and wiping his hands on his jeans. "Your brake line's leaking fluid," he said flatly. "And from the look of it, it might have hit your transmission too. Not safe to drive like this." Margaret felt a chill despite the Texas heat. "Can you fix it here?" Jason shook his head. "No way. You'd need tools, a lift, probably new parts." Reed stepped forward, his voice smooth and practiced. "Where were you headed? Maybe we can give you a lift." "We were going to the police station," Doris said, clutching her purse like a lifeline. "The police station?" Reed repeated, eyebrows rising. "Everything all right?" "Yes," Margaret said quickly, forcing a polite smile. "Just some follow-up about Jim's car." She avoided mentioning the blue handbag now resting quietly on the back seat. "Well," Reed said, "I can call a tow and have your car brought to the junkyard. I've got tools there. We can fix it up fast, cheaper than any shop in Austin." "That's very kind," Margaret began, but Doris cut her off sharply. "We'd rather go to the police station first," she said, her tone leaving no room for debate. Reed's expression didn't change, but Jason's eyes flicked toward him, just a fraction of a second, but enough for Margaret to notice. "Mom," she said softly, touching Doris's arm, "maybe it makes sense to get the car handled first. We can call Detective Reyes from the junkyard if we need to." "Exactly," Reed said with an easy grin. "No reason to let your car sit out here all night. I'll call a buddy who runs a tow company." Before either woman could respond, he had already stepped aside, dialing his phone. "They'll be here in about 10 minutes, he said after hanging up. The silence that followed was thick and uneasy. Doris's jaw was set, her lips pressed tight. Margaret could feel her mother's tension beside her, and she couldn't deny her own unease. Still, Reed had helped them before. Maybe this was all just another strange coincidence. A few minutes later, headlights cut through the dusk as a tow truck rolled up, its door painted with a company logo Margaret didn't recognize. The driver, a stocky man with tattooed forearms, said nothing as he hooked the sedan to the lift. Within minutes, her car was being towed away into the dark. "All set," Reed announced cheerfully. "Hop in. We'll ride back to the yard. I'll have Jason take a look at it right away." Margaret hesitated beside the truck. Doris lingered by the rear bumper, squinting at the license plate. "You coming?" Reed called, already in the driver's seat. "Yes, of course," Margaret said, though her voice trembled. Doris finally climbed in beside her, leaning close to whisper, "I don't like this. We should have called the police." Margaret squeezed her mother's hand, trying to sound reassuring. "It's fine, Mom. Just a quick ride." But deep down, a spark of dread flickered to life. Reed had shown up far too conveniently, just as their car failed. As they drove off, Margaret noticed her mother huddled in the back seat, hands hidden in her lap. A faint blue glow reflected off Doris's glasses. She was secretly texting. Good, Margaret thought. At least someone will know where we are. 15 minutes later, Margaret frowned, peering out at the unfamiliar streets passing by. "Reed, this doesn't look like the way to the police station." "Taking a shortcut," Reed said without looking back. "Less traffic this time of day." Jason shifted in his seat, then turned slowly to face them, his expression unreadable. The road ahead narrowed, lined with trees that cast long shadows across the fading light, shadows that seemed to close in around them with every passing mile. Margaret's voice hitched as she demanded, "Where are you taking us?" And Reed's friendly mask fell away, his knuckles whitening on the wheel as he said, cold and short, "Change of plans." Then everything went wrong. Jason's expression hardened, and without warning he reached beneath his seat and produced a small handgun with a suppressor and 2 sets of handcuffs, barking for both women to put them on. And when Margaret and Doris hesitated, he yelled, "Now, put them on or I'll shoot," forcing them to obey. The metal bit cold into Margaret's wrists. Then Jason roughly stuffed handkerchiefs into their mouths and snatched the blue handbag from Doris's lap, declaring, "It's not yours anymore," shoving them down into the cramped back seat while Reed's eyes met Margaret's in the rearview mirror, and he hissed, "Be quiet, or you'll never see another daylight," as they rattled further into the countryside. A rural chill sinking through her even as Doris's gloved fingers somehow texted a single desperate message, "Help," into the dark, sending a sliver of hope through Margaret's terror. And when the truck finally turned onto a narrow dirt road and the trees closed overhead, she prayed that someone outside the cab would find them. The road twisted under a fading sky for miles until it opened onto a lonely clearing with a sagging, white farmhouse and a battered camper. The porch slouched and paint peeling. No neighbors in sight. And Reed cut the engine about 50 yards from the house while Jason kept the gun trained on them as he hauled them out, their hands cuffed in front and mouths gagged, legs stiff from the ride. And they were marched, disoriented and afraid, toward the shabby door where the camper rocked as if someone inside was thrashing. Reed nudged Jason with a grim chuckle. "Boss is having his fun," and shoved them up the porch steps into a dim, mildew-scented interior that smelled of cigarettes and stale food, where a cluttered living room funneled them down a narrow hall to a cramped office lit by a single window and an old humming computer. And an older man with graying hair sat reading the paper like nothing was happening until Reed barked, "Watch them!" And Jason yanked the gags from their mouths and added, "We're getting a bite before the boss is done. Don't you talk to them." Then secured their cuffs to a stubborn radiator with a length of chain. Alone with the older man, Margaret's voice broke as she pleaded, "Please help us. We haven't done anything wrong." And Doris gasped that her daughter was a police detective who would find them, offering anything to spare his life. But the man's face was hard and wary as he glanced toward the hallway, torn between fear and compassion, the house settling around them like a trap, while the distant sound of the trailer's shaking and muffled music thumped the relentless rhythm of whatever horrors lay in wait. ChatGPT said, The older man didn't answer at first. He only lifted the newspaper, pretending to read, his trembling hands betraying the calm his face tried to project. "Please," Margaret pleaded, her voice cracking under the strain. "We're not here to cause trouble. I'm looking for my daughter and husband. They vanished 16 years ago." For several long minutes the two women begged, their voices echoing off the dingy walls, their words swallowed by the thick air of fear. The man kept glancing at the hallway as if the walls themselves were listening. Finally, the door creaked open, and Margaret tensed. But it was only him, stepping inside. His face had hardened, but his voice dropped to a hiss. "Quiet, both of you, or they'll hurt you. You don't know what kind of people you're dealing with." Doris's voice softened to a desperate whisper. Please, I'm Doris Barrett. This is my daughter, Margaret Holbrook. We're looking for my granddaughter, Lucia. She was 8 when she disappeared with her father. If she's here, if you know anything, please tell us. For a long, excruciating moment, the man stared at them, his eyes flat and unreadable. Then, after glancing down the hallway, his expression flickered. Something human glinting through the fear. They call her Samantha now, he murmured, barely audible. But I knew her name was Lucia. That's what they called her before they changed it, about 4 years ago. Margaret gasped so hard it hurt. She's here? Her voice broke into a sob. Lucia's alive? The man nodded once, sharply. Keep your voice down. If they find out I told you that, I'm as good as dead. Then help us, Margaret begged. You're not like them. I can see that. Please, we'll protect you. His lips pressed into a thin, hopeless line. Being a good man gets you killed here. Doris leaned forward, her eyes shining with conviction. Sir, we don't live forever, but we answer for what we do while we're here. Help us, and maybe God will help you. He looked away, jaw working, torn between self-preservation and conscience. Footsteps sounded in the hall, closer now. Doris whispered urgently, Please, just once more. I beg you. The old man let out a long, defeated sigh. I do this for Samantha, he muttered. Then, in one trembling motion, he pulled a battered phone from his pocket, dialed 911, and whispered the farmhouse's location before quickly hanging up. The phone disappeared into his coat just as the door burst open. 3 men stormed in, Reed, Jason, and the boss. The man was monstrous, thick-bodied, his gray-streaked hair plastered with sweat, a dirty tank top clinging to his bulk, his legs bristling with coarse hair and old tattoos. Margaret's stomach turned cold. She knew instantly this was the one Reed and Jason feared. What are you doing in here, Micah? The boss growled, his voice like gravel. You're not supposed to be with the prisoners. Micah flinched and stepped back. They were noisy, he said quickly. I was just telling them to keep quiet. The boss's eyes narrowed, suspicion curdling his face. Search him, he told Reed and Jason flatly. If he's got anything he shouldn't, handle it. You understand? Reed nodded without hesitation. Got it, boss. Reed grabbed Micah by the arm and forced him out, leaving Margaret and Doris alone with Jason and the boss. The room seemed to shrink as the boss stepped closer, his gaze crawling over them. So, he drawled, his breath sour. Reed tells me you're here for Samantha. His hand lifted and brushed Margaret's hair. She recoiled, chains clattering against the radiator. I like older women too, he sneered. Give her back to us, Margaret demanded, her fear boiling into fury. Her voice shook, but she didn't back down. The boss laughed, a low, chilling sound that seemed to fill the room. Oh, that's not how this works, he said darkly. But I'll tell you what does. He turned to Jason. Bring them in. Jason vanished down the hallway, returning moments later with 3 young women. They looked to be in their 20s, thin, each with long brown hair, their faces blank, eyes empty. They stood in a line before the boss, heads bowed like they'd been trained not to meet anyone's gaze. The boss's grin spread slowly across his face. Here's the game, he said, his tone dripping mockery. Pick which one's Samantha. No talking, no second guesses. Choose right. Maybe you walk out of here. Choose wrong. He tilted his head toward Jason's gun. Well, you won't get another try. They both had to point at the same time, the boss sneering like a carnival barker as he laid down the rules. Get it right, and maybe you get to see her. Get it wrong, and you get nothing. So, Margaret and Doris stared at the 3 young women lined up like sheep, their eyes scanning for anything familiar until Margaret's finger involuntarily trembled toward the woman with the small scar by her eyebrow, the same scar Lucia had from a childhood tumble, and Doris's hand moved to match hers. The boss barked a derisive laugh that filled the cramped room and, with a cruel showman's flourish, dismissed the other two women, leaving only the one they'd chosen. And for a moment, Margaret dared to hope as she whispered, "Lucia?" But the woman didn't even look up, her face a hollow, practiced neutrality that had the chilling calm of someone who had been trained to disappear. Then the boss's voice slid into a new, darker current, as he ordered the woman to strip, and the air went cold with Margaret and Doris's horror, while Samantha, mechanical and vacant, obeyed as if on cue, her movements void of resistance or recognition. The boss paused, savoring the power in the room, then turned his attention to Margaret with a leering grin and a hand that felt like an animal's, as he dragged her into the center of the floor, the chain clinking, and told the young woman to undress Margaret for him. Margaret's plea rose high and raw. "Lucia, I'm your mother." And for a heartbeat there was a flicker, an almost human hesitation in Samantha's eyes, before her expression slid back into numbness. The boss laughed, declaring he liked to play, and then, as terror tightened around Margaret like a vice, Reed burst into the doorway, pale and panicked, with the single-word warning that cut through everything. "The police are outside," and the shift was instantaneous. The boss's face went from leering to furious in a breath. He shoved Margaret aside, seized Samantha, and snarled for escape. But Reed's fear was immediate and raw. "No way out, boss. The perimeter's closed." And in a flash, the boss lunged for Reed's gun, intent obvious when Micah, who had stood apart in the room and whose conscience had betrayed him to act, threw himself between them and saved Margaret with two shots that echoed like thunder, blood blooming across his shirt as he fell. The boss scrambled for another weapon, enraged and bleeding, shouting for more munitions. But the sudden cacophony of breaking wood and authoritative shouts, "Police! Drop your weapons!" filled the farmhouse as officers swarmed in, their presence turning the room from a chamber of horrors into a controlled scene of rescue. Reed and Jason raising their hands and the boss staggering, wounded and still defiant, while Margaret, untied and trembling, collapsed into relief and nausea at once as she reached for Samantha's vacant body, whispering her name and getting no answer. And although the young woman's shell did not immediately respond, the arrival of law enforcement, doctors and detectives moving in, meant cages were opening. The nightmare was being hauled into the light, and Margaret clung to the terrible, fragile truth that they had finally found Lucia, even if the parts of her stolen childhood would take a long time to return. ChatGPT said, "Before anyone could move, the crack of splintering wood split the air, followed by the thunder of boots and the commanding roar of voices shouting, 'Police! Drop your weapons!' The front door burst inward as armed officers poured into the farmhouse, weapons raised, beams of light cutting through the dim haze. Reed and Jason instantly threw up their hands, faces drained of color, but the boss, wild-eyed and grinning, lunged toward an officer. A single gunshot cracked the chaos. The boss staggered, clutching his thigh as blood seeped through his fingers. But instead of falling, he laughed, a rasping, hollow sound that chilled everyone in the room. "You think that's gonna stop me?" he growled. Another shot fired. This one hit his shoulder, and he dropped to his knees, his laughter dissolving into a guttural snarl. Within moments, the nightmare unraveled. Officers swarmed the suspects, shouting orders as Reed, Jason, and the boss were handcuffed and dragged away. Paramedics knelt beside Micah, whose shirt was soaked crimson, trying desperately to stem the bleeding. A female officer hurried to Margaret and freed her wrists. She stumbled forward, past the noise and flashing lights, and found Samantha, her Lucia, standing blank and still amid the chaos. "Lucia," Margaret whispered, reaching trembling fingers toward her daughter's face. "It's me, honey. It's Mom." No recognition flickered in those empty eyes. The young woman stood unmoving, lost somewhere far beyond the reach of sound. Doris, now freed and wrapped in a paramedic's blanket, came to her daughter's side. Tears streaked her face as she gazed at the fragile figure before them. "We found her, Margaret," she sobbed. "After all these years, we found her." Margaret pulled Lucia close, her heart breaking at the weightless way her daughter leaned into her arms, her body present but her spirit seemingly gone. Red and blue lights pulsed across the night sky, illuminating the farmhouse and the surrounding trees like an eerie stage. Police moved methodically, photographing, tagging evidence, securing the property, while the paramedics tended to the wounded and shaken. Reed was shoved into a cruiser, head bowed, while Jason stared forward, expression vacant. The boss, bleeding but defiant, laughed again as he was loaded into another vehicle, the sound muffled by the closing door. A paramedic guided Margaret toward an ambulance. "Ma'am, we need to get you checked out," she said softly. Margaret sat numbly as they cleaned a small gash on her shoulder, the mark left when her blouse had been torn. Across the yard, Lucia sat on a stretcher, wrapped in a gray blanket, her vacant stare fixed on nothing. "She's physically fine," a medic told Margaret carefully, "but she's unresponsive, likely severe trauma. We'll get her to the hospital for evaluation." Doris joined them, her face drawn but steady. "She doesn't know us," Margaret murmured, her voice barely audible. "Not yet," Doris said, her hand firm on her daughter's arm. "But she will." At that moment, a stretcher passed them, Micah's face pale under the ambulance lights as medics rushed him toward the waiting vehicle. He'd saved them, Margaret realized, and her throat tightened. As the paramedics closed the doors and the sirens rose, she looked back once more at the broken farmhouse, the nightmare that had haunted 16 years finally dragged into the open. And in her arms, the faintest tremor passed through Lucia's fingers, small, fragile, but real. As if somewhere behind the silence, the first flicker of recognition had begun to stir. Micah, the older man who had stepped between her and death, was barely conscious as paramedics rushed him past, his chest wrapped in layers of blood-soaked bandages, while one medic held an IV high above him and shouted for space. "We need to move now! He's losing too much blood!" they yelled, voices sharp with urgency as the stretcher rattled toward the ambulance. Margaret stood frozen, watching the man who had risked everything for her, until a young officer approached gently. "Ma'am," he said, "the medics need to transport your daughter immediately. She's stable, but they want her evaluated by trauma specialists. They also recommend that you and your mother come with us to be checked out more thoroughly." Margaret's voice trembled. "Of course, but that man, Micah, will he survive?" The officer's expression softened, carefully neutral. "They're doing everything they can. He's still conscious, and they say he's a fighter." As they turned toward the waiting ambulance where Lucia sat wrapped in a blanket, another paramedic jogged up, his gloves streaked with Micah's blood. "Before you go," he said quietly, "you should know, Micah managed to tell us a few things before we loaded him. His full name is Micah Carraway. Reed Carraway is his son." Margaret stopped cold, disbelief flooding her. "His son?" The paramedic nodded grimly. "And the man who called himself the boss. His name is Charlie Carnes. He's Micah's stepbrother. Micah said Reed fell in with him years ago after some trouble at the junkyard." Doris's face twisted in shock. "That poor man, betrayed by his own son." "I'm sorry," the medic said, guiding them toward the vehicle. "The detectives will follow up with you at the hospital." Inside the ambulance, Lucia sat stiff and unmoving on the stretcher, her eyes vacant beneath the harsh interior lights. Margaret climbed in beside her and hesitated before reaching for her daughter's hand. "Lucia," she whispered softly, "we're here now, sweetheart. You're safe." No response. Just the steady hum of the road beneath them and the rhythmic wail of the siren cutting through the night. Doris reached over, squeezing Margaret's shoulder in quiet solidarity as the city lights blurred past the windows. At the hospital, chaos gave way to sterile calm. Doctors swept Lucia into an exam room while Margaret and Doris were ushered elsewhere for evaluation. Blood pressure checks, questions, paperwork. When it was finally over, They were led to a small consultation room, beige walls and fluorescent lights humming softly above. Margaret collapsed into a chair, exhaustion overtaking her like a wave. "I can't believe we found her," she murmured, voice trembling with equal parts relief and disbelief. "After all these years." Doris sat beside her, eyes glassy but resolute. "It's a miracle," she said. "But she's not the same, Margaret. She's been through hell." Margaret's hands shook in her lap as she tried to push away the images from the farmhouse, the chains, the fear, the look on Lucia's face. The door opened quietly, and Detective Reyes stepped inside, his face lined with fatigue, but gentler than before. "Mrs. Halbrook, Mrs. Barrett," he said, pulling up a chair. "I'm very relieved you're safe. It's been an extraordinary day for everyone." "Have you seen my daughter?" Margaret asked immediately. "Not yet," Reyes said carefully. "The doctors are still assessing her. She's physically unharmed, but they're concerned about her mental state." She hasn't spoken a word. "And Micah?" Doris pressed, voice trembling. "The man who saved us?" Reyes nodded. "He's in surgery. The doctors are optimistic. The bullets missed his vital organs. If he makes it through the night, they think he'll recover." Margaret exhaled shakily, tears welling in her eyes. "He gave up everything to save us." Reyes's jaw tightened. "He did the right thing, even after years of living in fear. We owe him." He paused before adding, "Reed Carraway, Jason, and Charlie Carnes are all in custody. We've already secured the blue handbag as evidence, and we're looking into whether Dean Lame, the junkyard owner, had any connection to what was happening there. I promise you, Mrs. Halbrook, this case isn't over, but tonight, at least, it's finished for you." Margaret nodded slowly, her eyes drifting toward the window where the faint red glow of ambulance lights reflected off the glass. "Not finished," she whispered. "Just the beginning of healing." And beside her, Doris squeezed her hand, both women silently praying that somewhere behind the silence, Lucia, the little girl they lost 16 years ago, was still waiting to be found. "Reed and Jason both told us quite a bit," Detective Reyes began, his tone measured but weighted with grimness. "We're still piecing everything together, but what we do know paints a horrifying picture." He exchanged a glance with his partner, Detective Morales, who took over quietly. "We immediately recognized Charlie Carnes when we saw him. He's a wanted serial predator, been on the FBI's radar for over 30 years. He drifts from town to town under fake names, taking advantage of vulnerable people, manipulating them, hurting them, sometimes for money, sometimes just for the thrill. He's left a trail of missing persons across at least 5 states. Morales paused, steadying her voice. "He often kept young women and girls captive, controlled them through fear and psychological conditioning. It's likely Lucia was one of them." Margaret's breath caught. Her vision swam. 16 years, she whispered, her stomach twisting. 16 years with that monster. "How did Charlie even cross paths with Jim and Lucia?" Doris asked, her voice trembling. "They didn't know people like that." Reyes folded his hands on the table. "Reed's been surprisingly cooperative. He said his time had finally come, his words. He claimed he was just a boy when it happened, 10 years old, and that Charlie was his step-uncle. He idolized him, saw him as strong and fearless, unlike his own father, Micah, whom he considered weak." Morales opened her notebook. "According to Reed, they were traveling near Marble Falls when they spotted your husband's red Cadillac. Charlie pretended they were a father and son stranded on the roadside. Jim, being who he was, stopped to help. When Charlie told him Reed was sick and needed rest, Jim offered them a ride. Later that evening, they all checked into a small roadside motel in Llano. Jim even paid for their room." Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth, tears spilling over. "That's exactly what Jim would have done. He could never turn anyone away." Morales' eyes softened. "That night, after they'd shared dinner at a local diner, Charlie drugged Jim's drink. When Lucia was asleep, he strangled your husband in the motel bathroom." A strangled sob escaped Doris. Margaret gripped her mother's hand so tightly her knuckles went white, her tears falling silently as the detective continued. Charlie then staged the scene to make it look like Jim had left voluntarily. He took Lucia, telling her her father had been hurt and was being taken to a hospital. She trusted him. She was 8. From that night on, Charlie kept her hidden, moving from state to state, forging documents, changing her name to Samantha. Over time, he manipulated her into believing you were gone too. He isolated her completely. Margaret's voice came out as a whisper, trembling. And my husband's body? Reyes took a breath. Reed and another accomplice, one of Charlie's drifters, stayed behind to clean up. They destroyed everything that could trace back to the motel. Charlie dumped Jim's body in an old limestone sinkhole off a ranch road outside Llano, then drove the Cadillac deep into the woods. It stayed there, untouched, until recently. Then how did it end up at the junkyard? Doris asked softly. Reed brought it in, Morales explained. After all these years, he still knew where it was, with Charlie's influence fading and guilt eating at him. He decided to crush it, erase it, finally. He thought 16 years was enough time that no one would ever connect the dots. The room fell silent. Margaret sat frozen, every word heavy as lead. Her husband murdered in a moment of compassion. Her daughter stolen and raised in captivity. 16 years of waiting and searching, all leading to this truth. We'll do everything possible to locate your husband's remains, Morales said gently. Reed's already pinpointed the area. A recovery team is being assembled. Margaret nodded numbly, unable to speak. Doris reached for her hand, holding on as if to keep her from collapsing. Then the door opened softly. A doctor entered, still in scrubs. Mrs. Hellbrook? Mrs. Barrett? He said. Your daughter's been moved to a private room. She's stable but still nonverbal. We'll be monitoring her closely. She's safe now. Margaret rose on unsteady legs, a tear sliding down her cheek as she whispered, After 16 years, she's finally home. I believe having you with her will help, the doctor said quietly, leading Margaret and Doris down the softly lit corridor toward a private recovery room. The rhythmic beeping of monitors echoed faintly through the hall until he opened a door to reveal Lucia lying motionless beneath crisp white sheets, her eyes fixed blankly on the ceiling. Though now 24, she looked impossibly small, fragile, like a shadow of the bright 8-year-old girl who had vanished so long ago. Margaret moved slowly to her bedside, her heart tightening at the sight. Lucia, she whispered, taking her daughter's cold hand between hers. It's Mom, and Grandma Doris is here too. For several long minutes, there was no response. Only the faint hum of machines and the sound of Margaret's trembling breath. Still, she kept talking. She told Lucia she was safe now, that Charlie and Reed could never hurt her again, that she was home. Doris joined in, their voices weaving gentle memories from Lucia's childhood. Birthday cakes, bike rides at Zilker Park, bedtime stories under the soft Texas glow. Minutes bled into an hour before a fragile sound broke the stillness. Lucia's lips parted, and a whisper emerged, dry and uncertain. I'm so sorry for being so broken. The words splintered something deep inside Margaret. She bent closer, her voice shaking. Oh, sweetheart, no. You have nothing to be sorry for. None of this was your fault. We're together now, and that's all that matters. Lucia's gaze finally flickered toward her mother. A single tear rolled down her cheek. I miss Daddy, she said, the word falling from her lips with the soft, childlike tone of the girl she'd once been. Margaret's throat tightened. I know, she whispered, brushing a strand of hair from Lucia's face. I miss him too. For the first time in 16 years, her daughter's hand curled faintly around hers. A nurse appeared quietly in the doorway. Mrs. Halbrook, she said softly, Mr. Carroway is awake. He's asking to see you. Margaret hesitated, glancing at Lucia. Doris touched her arm gently. Go, she urged. I'll stay with her. Margaret followed the nurse next door, where Micah Carroway lay pale and bandaged, oxygen tubes resting across his face. His eyes opened as she entered. "Mrs. Halbrook," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "I needed to apologize for my son, for keeping silent all these years." Margaret moved closer, her tone steady but kind. "You saved my life, Micah. You saved my daughter. That's what matters." He closed his eyes briefly, pain etched deep in his expression. "Reed always hated gentlemen like your husband. Saw kindness as weakness. When they hitched that night, Charlie said they'd found the perfect mark. Your husband stopped because he cared." His breath hitched. "I should have stopped them back then. I didn't, and for that, I'm sorry." Margaret took his frail hand in hers. "You risked everything to make it right," she said softly. "There's nothing left to forgive." Micah nodded faintly, tears glimmering in his eyes before exhaustion pulled him back into sleep. When Margaret returned to Lucia's room, the world seemed quieter, gentler. Lucia was asleep now, her face peaceful, her breathing steady. Doris sat beside her, eyes glistening as she kept watch. Margaret sank into the chair opposite and reached across the bed to hold her daughter's hand once more. After 16 long years of searching, of praying into the dark, she had finally found her child. The journey ahead would be painful, uncertain, but they would face it together, step by step, rebuilding what time and cruelty had broken. As the first light of dawn touched the hospital window, Margaret silently thanked whatever force had guided them to that forgotten junkyard. The crushed red Cadillac, the weathered blue handbag, and the chain of small mercies that had finally brought Lucia home. After 16 years of searching, a mother's faith finally brought her daughter home. The road to Sassoon. Healing will be long, but through courage, love, and one act of sacrifice, the truth finally saw daylight. Sometimes, the smallest detail, a torn handbag, a single act of kindness, can expose years of buried evil. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes that hope never dies. And if you'd like to see more real-life mysteries like this one, remember to subscribe and turn on notifications, because some stories, like Margaret and Lucia's, deserve to be heard.